The Pulse Dash dashboard gives an overview of all your athletes' throwing workloads on your team roster. It shows off some of the main metrics of Pulse like AC ratio, acute workload, and chronic workload. Your acute workload is a weighted average of your throwing workload for the last 9 days. This is weighted, meaning that yesterday's throws are going to count more than a week ago. Chronic workload is a measure of the throwing workload over your last 28 days. Dividing the acute workload by the chronic workload gives an athlete's AC ratio. If an athlete's acute workload is similar to an athlete's chronic workload, that would result in an AC ratio close to 1.0. In other words, this athlete has not increased or decreased their throwing workload relative to the last month. An AC ratio of 0.7 to 1.3 is considered a safe range for your athletes to be with their AC ratio. These are highlighted in green. An AC ratio between 1.3 and 1.6, or between 0.4 and 0.7, would be considered caution zones. You'll see that anything within those ranges are highlighted in yellow, whereas anything higher than 1.6 is what is considered a danger zone for the athlete, and that athlete's workload should be monitored more closely. If an athlete threw that day, the circle on the left will be highlighted in green, and the throw count will appear in this column. Beyond just throw count, the athlete's one-day workload will show up in this column here. One-day workload takes into account the athlete's total throws as well as the intensity of each one of those throws. This means an athlete who throws the same number of throws at lesser intensity would have a lower one-day workload. Arm health is a 7-day average based on the athlete's response in the 1 to 10 survey of how their arm is feeling that day. If an athlete's pulse account is linked to their track profile, the primary workout for that day will show up in this column here. This makes it easy to see what type of throwing workout that athlete has that day. The graph on the right shows an overview of the athlete's last few weeks of throwing. Here you can see the one-day workload that they had that day, as well as the AC ratio that resulted after their workout. The graph at the bottom shows the chronic workload over time. You can see if an athlete is increasing or decreasing their overall throwing workload. Long-term trends lets users see how certain athletes' metrics are trending over time. For example, we can look at an athlete's acute to chronic workload ratio. Since we're at the day average tab here, you'll be able to look at their AC ratio for each day. You can also add a secondary metric to look at things like average torque for a certain day and see how they overlap. Maybe you want to see how arm slot relates to torque values, or how arm slot relates to arm speed. You can also filter for just high effort throws and view this in a bar chart. The same thing can be done on a week average as well. If you only want to view certain days, you can select the days that you want this to take effect. Interday Data lets a user look at each individual throw that they made. Here's where you can view the torque values associated with each throw, as well as any tags corresponding with it. You can toggle on different metrics like arm speed, arm slot, and shoulder rotation to view the metrics that you want to look at. You'll also be able to sort for all throws or just the high effort throws. The timestamps will appear for every throw that you've made as well. We can see exactly when certain throws were made and how much time was made between each one. If we want to delete certain throws, we can select the throws that we want to delete and delete them with this option here. Or we can change the date to a different time or add a tag. Now all of these throws will have the catch play tag right here. Box score tag analysis allows the user to analyze different metrics based on the tag for each given throw. The first step is to choose a metric that we want to look at, such as torque. If we hover over each column, we'll be able to see how different metrics trend with different tags. We can also sort for just the high effort throws. Report Generator lets the user build a report for a player or for an entire team. Select the player that you want to build a report for and the date, and then select Generate Report. This is helpful if you want to give athletes daily results of their throwing workload. You can also do a similar thing for generating workload reports, which shows more of a history of how they've thrown over time. Another useful report would be a game day report for a coach, where the coach can look at how the team fares today or tomorrow for a given day. This table shows an athlete's AC ratios depending on how much throwing workload they did in tomorrow's game. For example, test player here has a 0.6 one-day workload and can comfortably throw a 42 one-day workload without a big spike in his AC ratio. Test player 2 and 4 are both over 1.3, so they probably shouldn't be throwing based on the AC ratio recommendations. Test player 3 can throw a one-day workload of around 6 before he begins to get into that caution zone. And test player 5 can also get a comfortable zone roughly around 42 for tomorrow's game. The program builder lets coaches build their throwing programs in a safe and effective manner. The first thing to do is select an athlete and the date that you want to begin their throwing program. The next step is to generate workload units for that athlete's tagged throws. If the athlete has tagged throws within the given date range, the average workload units per throw will appear for each tag. These workload metric averages will be specific to this particular athlete. For example, this athlete's average workload unit per throw during catch play is 0.09 workload units. We can click and drag this tag into their throwing plan and select the number of throws to start building their throwing program for that day. This can be done for other tags as well. You'll notice as the number of throws changes, the resulting one-day workload and AC ratio will update as well. You can also get workload averages for any subtags. To do this, click on a certain tag to view all of the subtags associated with it. If the athlete has not tagged any throws on a certain tag, but you want to include that in their program, you can edit the tag and manually enter an estimate for their workload units, either by inputting the estimated workload unit per throw, or by entering a specific average torque value, and it will convert it to workload units for you. The same thing can be done for tags with already existing workload units on it. Now you can drag this tag into the athlete's throwing program. Once the throwing plan for that day is complete, you can save the changes for that day. Hitting Simulate Workload will simulate these throws into the athlete's account to reflect actual throws for that day. This should only be used if the athlete is not using his or her sensor on that day. You can also favorite this throwing plan if you wish to use it as a template for a future date. Simply enter the name of this throwing program and click on the gold star to add it as a favorite. You'll have the option to save it for the entire team or just for that athlete. This saved workout will then appear in the Throwing Plans tab, and you can drag that onto future days with a similar throwing plan. From here, this can then be edited for any minor adjustments. Having saved workouts makes it easy to build athletes' throwing programs into the future. You can also copy days directly from the athlete calendar to duplicate that workout for a different day in case you don't want to save it as a favorite. You can delete throws using the delete button shown here. Using the program builder makes it easy to build athletes' throwing programs into the future and make sure that they're not overthrowing or underthrowing throughout the year. The Account tab is where you can change your username and password, add athletes to your team's roster, link athletes' track profiles to their accounts, and purchase and assign seat subscriptions for your athletes. Manage Subteams lets the coach categorize their players into different subteams to only view specific athletes from a team or a group. This allows you to easily monitor all your athletes' throwing workloads in one centralized spot throughout the year.